when we're thinking about what is thought, actually. So it's thought is not just, I was just thinking about this because I think previously I kind of, I didn't give it as much thought as I needed to, but thought is not just propositions. Um, it's actually, I would say propositions are not the essence of thought. The thought itself is like, it's, if I have to think of the characteristics of thought, I think of focusing, like a high level
Yes.
of focus and an observation of similarities and differences. And that observation can take a perceptual form, meaning I'm looking out into the world and making those observations. So it could be pre-verbal, or it
Mhm.
can be on the level of abstractions when I'm recalling specific propositions, generalizations, concepts, and then I'm thinking of the characteristics of those things referenced and I'm comparing them to something else, right? So the essence of thought is more like, observation is too broad, but it's observation of maybe similarities and differences. Would you agree that that's close to the essence of what thought is?
Um, Genus, at least. Uh,
Genus is observate cognition of some kind, maybe observation.
yes,
I
I
don't know.
would. I mean, usually that's what people mean when they say thought. They mean, well, it could depend. It could say, you might say, oh, what's that dog thinking? But you don't mean what concepts they holding in
Mm,
their mind.
mm-hmm.
You mean more of something along of what are they imagining in a way? In a way, what is their visualization? What is this pre-verbal thing in there? Because if they think of anything, if they can know that your arrival at the house means you're going to feed them, they need to be able to at least note or expect that there will be some food thing that'll come to them in some way that it's not in front of them, obviously, but they know it's coming. So there's that kind of awareness, which isn't obviously conceptual, but how do you hold that thing in your mind without it being there in front of you? How do they even react to something that's
I,
not yet there? So
I
they
would
hold
say
something.
in the case of a dog, it is in front. It is still in front of you because he can smell it,
True.
or it's an association, like the smell of you arriving at the door, and then that cues food arriving, which is different from um, even let's go to a primitive tribe that does not speak many words. The being able to think into the future, how do I kill this animal the
Yeah,
next
that
time?
kind.
Oh, this, and then there's way more distance between. It's less.
Right.
I don't know how to word it right now, but there. I guess there's, so thought has to, on some level, be related to abstraction, but it doesn't have to be verbal. Like you can have quite primitive. Um, yeah, I don't know, but it does seem to have. I would say there's some need to make a distinction between what a human is doing and what an animal is doing. Like, so when the dog is running towards you
Right.
because he thinks you're going to give it food, um, there's maybe there's a word you want to give that a word, but then there's got to be a word to describe what a
Yes.
human is doing when it's like way beyond what
Yeah.
that process is.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you want to distinguish those kinds of processes, one from maybe a basic like awareness of something
Mm-hmm.
going to happen. But I meant more like, I mean, yeah, there's always some perceptual connection with an awareness of what's coming, but the actual object of their hunger, that what they want isn't the thing in front of them, it's you, and then the association and all that. It's just several areas removed from the object, which humans are even more removed from it in such a way that they need to be able to hold it conceptually. So we can think of, say, verbal thoughts that are conceptual. We can say also maybe there's pre-verbal, as you'd say, which would be, if they're not verbal, they're in some sense non-conceptual. Would that make sense to you? Would you agree?
I would say that. Well, I don't know actually. I think that yes, almost all thoughts are verbal and therefore conceptual.
Right.
But
Right.
I do wonder, because I don't have knowledge about this, if there are, like the Chinese, their alphabet is still, they don't have an alphabet, right? But they have characters, and the origin is that they were graphical. And so I do wonder if people, at some point, there were just people were thinking in images. I don't know if that's possible, but
yeah, well, at least we can make these aware of these distinctions, that there could be more imagination type thoughts, and then there could be this conceptual thought, whatever
Right.
word you want to use. And
right.
thought might be a better word for these conceptual ways of thinking that we know it's not just when you think about, say, well, at least there's different kinds of thoughts. You can say, if you're thinking about, say, I'll give you an example. Say your arguments for why principles are important. Whatever the argument is, that's not really visual. It's just like a deliberative process, like one proposition to another, or one statement to another. It's not really, they're just strictly linguistic or verbal.
Right.
But then you could also imagine, say, a geometric, or forget geometric, let's think
Yes.
visualizing something and assembling it. That with
Yes.
like mental rotation or
Yes.
imagining or imagery.
That's
And
what
that's
I
the
was
type of thought, but it's clearly not. They might need concepts, but it's a different kind of thinking than this
Right.
deliberative proposition form.
Right. Yes.
And
Actually,
then,
that's a good point. I didn't think about that.
and then we could have this even maybe more primitive for animals, for whatever you want to call that, where they can anticipate and react and predict the future to a small degree. Like maybe people don't know that they'll need to get, well, just to a minimal degree. So we could distinguish that in another further way. And obviously plants don't have any kind of thought, because they're not even moving towards anything. They're stationary for the most part.
I remember, so I when I tried to conceptualize this, the two features that are distinctive to thought are, one, that it's purposeful,
Yes.
and two, that it's sustained over time.
Yes.
And I think that's one significant difference also, putting aside conceptual and imaginative.
Yes.
The reason this came up is because actually what you said is before about what you said before about geometry is a good example, because I remember reading about I was reading about Da Vinci, and he would rotate mentally like 16-sided shapes and transform them into a different shape, but he'd mentally do that before he drew it, which is crazy. But that would have had to be thought. You can't just do that on some kind of magical instinct. Like there's got to be some kind of painful mental process in order to mentally completely transform one geometric shape to another. But that, I don't know, there's no verbal, it would be hard for me to imagine that there's a verbal process that happens with that.
Right. I agree.
And then
I think they're all important distinctions, and often there's a conceptual element to it.
And then I was thinking about a child, when we say, okay, we know how to put on clothes, and you think about, okay, does all action presuppose thought? But a child doesn't necessarily, or I can't remember going through a reasoned thought process using concepts to learn how to put on clothes. It's more like the learning process is learning in the doing, just like when you learn to ride a bicycle, there's some different process from when you learn about justice, right? Like you get on the bicycle, it doesn't matter if you read a book, you're not going to learn to ride a bicycle. And I was trying to capture what that is, because is that thought? Like for someone to, it's almost like, it's more like learning to use, it's a different kind of learning, right? It's not the same.
Yeah, that's what I would think of. I mean, this is clearly a more in-depth question than Rand even ever talked about. Right. She just distinguished that, well, it happens, but what exactly are these distinctions they're doing? When is it breakdown from merely a perceptual process, like your eyes can put together a wholeness of something. Like you can see a whole tree. It's not like you see all the parts of a tree, you just see a tree. I mean, there's just strictly that. But then how do you go from there to discriminating this tree from that tree, to knowing that there's a difference
Right.
and choosing one over the other? That's where it gets really tricky. I mean, it seems like there would need to be some kind of thought to at least discriminate, but that kind of discrimination doesn't seem to need anything advanced. So we might want, what could that be? So only that's where it gets tricky, but
right.
At least we can distinguish these higher forms of thinking. Like you can understand that there's thinking about geometry and moving shapes in your mind, which requires some concept of what shapes are, but then you have to also understand the logical arrangement of things. So you had those both aspects.
Yeah, actually, I was just thinking one way to simplify this, not simplify it in terms of answering what is the essence of thought in each of those different contexts, but simplify it in terms of thinking about it, is that all of them are still related to focus. So you can choose,
Yes.
just because I see a 16-sided geometrical shape doesn't mean that my mind has already arranged it into the many infinite configurations, let's say, or the many configurations that are possible for it, like Da Vinci has. He had to focus on that specifically. And so
Right.
it simplifies it in that sense because, okay, you can tie it back to, you have the choice, basically.
And Aristotle made some kind of argument similar to that, or at least he does argue that all thought requires imagination. That imagination might not require deliberation, but deliberation always requires something.
Right.
He said visual, but that's not quite true. But you still need to, whatever imagine is, you need to be able to do that. Just not, doesn't necessarily have to be visual, but well, that's just more technical argument. But yes, the idea is that you need imagination to think. Like we're saying about the triangles.
And you think imagination in his case was almost getting at focus?
It was part of it was focus.
Got it.
He didn't say the word focus, but he did mention about like deliberate or discrimination between things. And he always mentioned that a lot, even just as far as animals, just making a discrimination between things. He had some good observations that Rand clearly built off of. And I think there could be a lot more said about how he believed that thinking requires imagination, which is interesting observation. I think Rand would grant that too from some of the things I've seen her write.
Right.
And her other statements in Ito, she's mentioned about visualization, things like that.
Well, when I think of a concept, I'm not when I think, if I want to consider two different things and how they relate to each other, and I've conceptualized both. So as an example, let me see if I can think of an example. Oh, okay. All right. Well, actually, the example relating back to that little quote from Raskolnikov on how 1,000th of a mark turns into like a pyramid of evidence against you. I'm relating, in that case, I want to relate honesty, the concept, to that proposition. Like the proposition is almost the concrete, because you're thinking of Raskolnikov and how he's paranoid about leaving. Like, what was it? The paintbrush? Was it this? Was it that? So you've got that. You're visualizing that, right? And then you're thinking, okay, what is honesty? And then you think about, okay, you think of specific concretes where you left something out, or you, as in like lying by omission, or you told something something that isn't true, and then something else in reality contradicted that. And so in some sense you have to, like, you've got the concepts and you've got the essences or whatever, but then you have to, if you're thinking about them, you do start breaking them down into kind of pictures and actual things, right?
Yeah, you would need to, I think. I don't know if you could, whether or not they're exactly pictures, it's still something not verbal. It's not words. It's something else. At least we could say that.
Yes. So I was wondering if you know if there are, so in the at the start of Philosophy Who Needs It, there are a couple of descriptions about the
Yeah.
questions someone might come to, the answers someone might come to about what kind of universe they live in. So one is
Hmm.
the one ruled by natural laws and therefore is stable, firm, absolute, and knowable.
Hmm.
And there's another one which is incomprehensible, realm of inexplicable miracles, unknowable flux, which your mind is impotent to grasp. And then, a world of illusions. Are there names or concepts for these in philosophy? Like, these are descriptions, but are there names for this kind of thing? Like, this is this kind of universe, or this is that kind of universe.
Well, the first one is what I showed you in that passage where Aristotle has the belief that there's determinate rules to the universe.
Is it a determinate or indeterminate then?
No, I was using the word determinate as in knowable,
Determinate universe. Yeah,
not
okay,
determined, but then there
determinate.
is like, I mean, that's different than determined. Determined is usually like billiard balls, like
Yeah,
one
yeah.
billiard ball hits another, and that would be deterministic.
That's why I wrote determinate. Is that what you mean?
Yes, determinate is better.
Yes.
Deterministic is like there's no no such thing as free will.
Okay.
That sort of attitude. And
Got it.
indeterminate being that, well, it ultimately it's not knowable because
Okay, so
everything is like
that
random.
would be this one, indeterminate. So it is, you
Yes.
can capture it with a concept.
Yes.
There we go. And then what about everything being an illusion? That would be the same as indeterminate, just a variation of?
No, it would be to say that maybe it is determinate, but not with our consciousness, or that our senses prevent us from reaching a determinate our understanding.
A determinate
So it's a little
universe.
different.
Okay.
But you could believe it's determinate, but that you can't determine yourself, which is more like there's a God's eye view, but humans can't find it. That's what it'd be like. God makes reality a certain nature, but he gave us a imperfect way to apprehend reality.
So, okay, determinate universe, but I don't know how to call it. I guess you could
I'll
call
just
it an
say,
incompetent consciousness, but that wouldn't be what
or
I don't think.
unreliability of the senses is a very common theme.
Okay.
I can't think of a single word, but unreliability of the senses is what this boils down to, which the person might then say, therefore the universe is unknowable and nothing could be known. Or they might say that if we were perfect, we could understand it, but we're flawed.
Right.
So, and those are pretty much how everything comes down, even from ancient Greece. There's always been some form of all of these, like the determined universe. What is predetermined as determinism? That's Democritus, and he believes in atomism, which is everything is just one atom hitting another, and that determines what reality is. And reductionism is another term for that.
But that's almost a view. So there's two things that are tied up here, and this is, I think, why it's a good example of why metaphysics and epistemology develop simultaneously. Because if you say everything in the universe is made up of atoms, the fact that you then say, okay, well, man is determined, is a view of man as opposed to a view of the universe, because we know that it makes sense to say everything is determinate, but consciousness is, it's like everything has a cause, it's determined, but consciousness is a cause, as in free will, volition is a cause. And so would you say that I could characterize that view as having a particular, like it's the combination of the epistemology, so the view of man and his consciousness, and the view of the universe. And so depending on what you think in either of those fields will determine your overall view of the universe, whether it's a determinate and determined universe, or a determinate and no, an indeterminate, no, wait, a determinate universe, but that's incomprehensible by us, something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I would do it a bit differently. That I think usually is the metaphysical premise that if everything's an atom, Therefore, everything is just atoms hitting each other, nothing else.
Okay.
And that would be Democritus and would lead to the idea that free will is an illusion.
Okay.
Because everything is just that way. There's no thinking. Everything reduces to atoms. Everything is that. And Aristotle argued against that. But he said the universe is determinate, that it is knowable and follows rules, but it isn't just merely atoms hitting each other. It's more than that. There's more to understand about reality. And that's what he had its four causes. It's not just things moving. There's other aspects of change besides just atoms moving. And that's what Aristotle did. And that was distinguished also from those who thought the universe was indeterminate because it was changing forever. That was, who was that? Heraclitus. He thought everything was changing at every moment. Therefore, reality is unknowable.
I'm going to send you a cute little clip if you haven't already seen it from Monty Python and all these philosophers, the Greeks and all the modern philosophers having a soccer match. It's like 2 minutes.
I've seen it many times.
Oh, yeah. You've already seen it. Okay, cool.
Yes.
I think that these viewpoints are completely uninteresting to anyone. They seem like jumping into an abstract vortex that has nothing to do with anything, unless you can relate it to their life. And I think part of the difficulty is that it's like that story about the fish. You know, there's three fish swimming, and so two of the fish pass this older fish passes these two younger fish, and he asks them, "How's the water?" And they're like, "What are you talking about?" And so I think that when you're like, there's so many things that we take for granted, and that I'm trying to find them out, but you take them for granted, and then it just seems there are certain things that seem self-evident to you. And it's only when you come into contact with a completely different culture, like the Greeks did, where you then might take interest in these questions when you see how they do relate to the day-to-day. But it's so difficult to relate. Like, okay, we're talking, I can see talking about Heraclitus's view of everything is change, and people's eyes would just roll, because it's like, you're like, well, what does this have to do with anything, right? I think that's the difficulty.
It is. That's why I like art and fiction so much, because I think that's always the best way to make it into something meaningful.
Right.
It's hard to find these things concretely, except in art. I can see it in so much art that I like. There's always some question of all these things. Can we determine anything? Is anything unknowable? And do our senses mean anything? On some level, I think it just has to be interesting, but you could demonstrate it to people. It's finding the right stories. Which Rand, I think, did very well. That's why I think she's, as much as she said that could be just Aristotle, she demonstrated in a very vivid and clear way to demonstrate concretely what philosophy means.
I think
Not
so
just
too.
like, oh, here's the cool thoughts, but this is what it is visually. This is what it means to your life. And that's what you need to bring if you want to make philosophy relevant. Part of that is a personal aspect to find what connects to you personally.
Well, on that topic, actually, I was going to ask you for some examples. So for a chaotic, incomprehensible universe, I wrote down Kafka's Metamorphosis. When he turns into an insect and he's randomly abused and nothing makes any sense. That's a good example of like a subconsciously view of that.
Kafka's good for like indeterminate universe. Determinate universe would probably be maybe some of the Foundation trilogy. I mean, there's a mix of stuff, but by Isaac Asimov, there's a character that tries to predict the future from, he called it psychohistory, where he predicted the future of history based on psychological principles in a way that's saying the universe is determinate and is determined even, that we can predict humans perfectly. And that's a good example. Well, maybe that's more determined universe. Determinism, rather.
Buddhist,
illusion.
but they're not good examples. Like I know from Musashi, for example, there's a
Yeah.
priest who hits his head on a wall because he's got sexual desires and he can't get rid of his illusions.
Well,
But
illusion
it's
is
such a bad concretization.
matrix for the
Oh
illusion.
yeah, the
For
Matrix.
sure.
Yeah.
Natural
Yeah.
law, let's see. I try to think just strictly determinism. It
Or
would be
even
very,
date like modern examples in the culture, like it would be good too. If I can't, it's so hard to think of them. But see, if you could jump from culture to culture, like if you could go to like 1000 AD and join the English, and then go visit the Vikings, and then go back to Rome, and then go to Greece. Like it might be easy when you start having these absurd conversations with people, and they just tell you things that you're like, that makes no sense. But because now it's a bit harder to do that. Like even because so many cultures are, there's more similarity among cultures now. There's less of that you can get in person.
I think, determinate universe, that the knowable one that is understood in with free will could be Dark Knight, could be an example of that. Because it also has examples of indeterminate universe, like the Joker thinks like there is no order to anything. It's all chaos. And Batman's thinking like this can be understood. We can find an answer. We can do the right thing.
Determinate and what was that?
Indeterminate.
Oh,
Joker being
indeterminate.
indeterminate. Like the Joker is pure chaos. That nothing
Yeah.
is knowable. Everything's arbitrary.
Okay.
And Batman believing that there is a truth to follow and to know, and that the chaos can be overcome through whatever process you have.
That's a good one. And what about, have you seen the Joker, like the
Yes.
later film where the guy?
Yeah. Yeah, it's more indeterminate. Like the Joker himself is like a character who viewed everything as indeterminate. So it's just all arbitrary and absurd to him.
Well, you could also view it as how do I word this? Is like a man is like a pawn of all his inner demons. He's like
Yeah.
I think there's that quote by Carl Jung, which is men continue. I can't remember, like make the unconscious conscious, or things will continue happening to you and you'll call it fate, something like that, which is like basically you're a slave of your unconscious. I think that, or like Freudian, that's the Freudian view as well.
Yeah.
Right.
Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
That
Which is a
sounds
kind
Jungian.
of, it is a kind of, is a kind of view of man as, I would say that's a metaphysics, right? Man is a
Yeah.
determined view of man.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Okay.
Um,
Actually, I didn't think of that though, so I'm gonna write it.
I'm trying to think of other genres besides the sci-fi and dark ones I usually like. Well, natural law. Let's see. And I think those are usually examples for like detective stories that are good. Some maybe Hitchcock sometimes.
That's the Carl Jung quote I'm thinking about, which speaks to man as determined in a sense, although it's conditional because he's saying you can make the unconscious conscious, right?
Yeah.
So but if you were to say that you can also view it as you're the helpless plaything of your own unconscious, which would be determinate.
By the way, when I said foundation, I meant that fit under determinism, not under natural law.
Sorry?
Foundation was supposed to be under determinism.
Oh, okay. Cool. I think that's probably enough.
Yeah.
About there.
Yeah.
Get more later as I read more. And I look for it I'm always looking for it in the.
It's
actually,
singular, just foundation.
Foundation. Okay. There's one here as well. Let's see. Well, actually, how would you categorize this one? There's something to it too, but is there some implicit metaphysical view in this?
Maybe that meaning cannot be objectively determined. I don't think it says, it's hard to say what else, but it seems to be that it's almost like pessimism, but not quite.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to capture. Like, how do you capture when a certain quote or person or thing embodies a particular view of suffering? Like, there's different views of suffering, right? Like, some people view suffering
Yeah,
as the norm of
yes,
existence itself because suffering exists.
yeah,
So they grant it a certain amount of importance. But I don't know how that fits into like a philosophical a view in metaphysics when you have a certain view of suffering.
yeah. That's where it gets complicated when you introduce additional concepts like suffering
Right,
or pain, or
right,
because then it could be like an interaction among all these things.
right.
Like you could say there's rules, but
You're
we
right.
can't
Yeah,
find them, or that
yeah,
once we find the rules, who really cares? It doesn't matter
yeah,
anyway.
yeah. You're right. So the view is it's an interaction in that it could include both a view of man and his consciousness and of
Yes,
existence itself.
yes.
And what
The
about
more
this one?
nuanced people get very nuanced. Like Nietzsche could be nuanced, Jung could be nuanced.
Yeah,
It's not strictly one view. As to say somebody like way back is your like Democritus, you probably could just, there's one view and there's not as much nuance.
actually, you know what's cool? I just thought about this. If you have a determinate view of man, then the implication of that, the implication that you must logically draw out of that is it would affect the way you treat other men. Because if you feel that a man is self-responsible, then
Yes.
you would judge him on the basis of the things in his control, like his actions and
Yeah.
his convictions. Is that basically his convictions and his actions, the thing he says and the thing he does, the things he does. Whereas if you don't have that view of man, that he's self-responsible, and you think to a large extent he is determined by his subconscious, his unconscious, his Freudian urges or whatever, then you have to judge him on the basis of his subconscious too.
Probably yes.
So
Something
that
to that
affects the
effect.
ethics. Yeah.
Yeah, or you reject ethics entirely, saying since you can't decide, it doesn't matter.
Right.
It's just a
Yes.
matter of about your environment, or all different nuanced views of that, some version of that.
What about this one? What implication could we bet? What wider metaphysical or epistemological worldview could we back out of this statement that I've just bolded? There's a split here between values and facts.
Yeah.
And so there's some kind of split, but I don't know what that would imply for
It's
for
almost
metaphysics.
everything. Money is almost everything. Seems very pragmatic,
Yeah, I think so too. But then,
consequentialist. It's very consequentialist, I think.
right, there's a difference between means and end, right?
Yeah, it's viewing as the ends as all that matters. That the consequences of your life is, it's not about how you get there as long as you get there. And money is almost everything because it allows you to get to any end you might want. You could argue it that way. Like you have $10 billion, you pretty much can realize any goal you want for any reason. And that's just consequentialism. Just how do you get there? The how you get there doesn't matter, because it doesn't really matter the means you treat your mind to get there, as long as you get there.
Right. It's interesting.
Versus deontology, we're saying the way you get there is the only thing that matters. It doesn't
Right.
matter if you ever get there, as long as you
Right.
do it.
I was just thinking now, okay, so we gave the example of how in metaphysics and epistemology, one worldview can lead you to certain views in ethics or the way you conduct yourself. Like we gave the example just then of if you view man as determined, then that's going to have an implication on the way you judge other men and deal with them. But on the other hand, if you begin with a statement like this about money and virtues, then it's going to have an implication for your metaphysics and your epistemology, whether you know it or not, right? So it goes both ways. Like do you know what I'm saying? The implications run. Yeah.
Depends what you treat as foundational. I mean, if you treat this as your main reasoning point, then yes, it would. Because people can treat as their foundation different things. And somebody just treats money as their foundation, well, they're probably gonna come to a certain view about metaphysics.
Yeah, although it's hard. I don't know what you'd back out of this one, right? There's a difference. There's like the split between means and ends, values and facts. But
yeah,
I don't know what else you could say
it's
about
harder
like as far as like metaphysics.
For metaphysics, it's too removed from metaphysics. I think to say too much, other than it looks like consequentialism, and whatever the consequentialist thinks is probably what's going on here.
Well, I guess if we're saying it's pragmatic, then there's a kind of primacy of consciousness, maybe, but I don't know.
Perhaps.
Anyways, pretty hard to go deeper in that.
I mean, from 4 lines, so all you could probably tell.
Sorry?
It's only 4 lines long, so really all we could get of it anyway.
Right. Okay.
About the 4 causes, I wrote something up for you to clarify that.
Was that in the email?
Yes.
Okay, because I haven't. I'm going to read that on my own, and then we can talk about it.
I'm just letting you know.
Yeah, I looked at it. I saw everything you sent me. Yeah, cool. Well, we can apply. I'll have to go through it. Then. All right. Let's see what else I want to ask you about. In the time we have left, let me see. So much stuff in here now. Well, actually, let's just go to the vision of Ayn Rand and see what's in there. I think we did reason and virtue last time. Okay. Okay. So this is something that, I mean, this kind of relates to my whole difficulty with trying to understand principles. So what causes a difference between, when you're saying, okay, self-esteem is a conviction that you're right in principle, not that you're concretely right in every particular choice you make. But what causes that disparity? If you're right in principle, when are you wrong in the particular choice you make? I can think off the top of my head, I can think of one is you've made an error, but even then, if we're saying you've made an error in applying the principle, that would be one. You've got the principle right, you've made an error in applying it.
Yeah.
Or the other one is that I know so this is from epistemology. So there's 2 ways you can be wrong, right? There's 2 ways you can be wrong. So one is you've erred in the method, so you've not applied objectivity correctly, and so whatever happens contradicts your old knowledge, which I don't think applies in this case unless you've erred specifically in applying the principle to the specific concrete. The second way you can go wrong is that there's some disqualification that's been introduced, like there's some factor you haven't accounted for. So like, with the blood types example, like, there's RH factor. Okay, it doesn't contradict my old knowledge, but here's an added disqualification to that knowledge. And so when we're talking about, being right in principle, but not concretely right in every particular choice you make, what are the sources? Like, what are the causes of the disparity that you can think of? Like, why, it just, I know it's dangerous here because I'm at risk of doing that thing that I'm used to doing, which is agitating against the fact that we're not omniscient and we're not infallible. But
I did write something about this, so I have additional things to say, but as for the shortest answer I can give is that they're abstractions of generalizations. They aren't specifics. They aren't, always capturing every concrete instance, because there could be differences of the concretes themselves that you may have not been able to predict, or they're not concrete principles of our general statements. They're not dealing with the concretes or what the concretes will necessarily look like your
Yeah.
principles of moral action until you attain a flourishing life, but not what the flourishing life looks like. As an individual, it might look completely different from another person, even if you follow the same principles. So I think you could be incorrect. So how could you be incorrect if you apply the principle
Think about
correctly?
think about this, right? Like there is some important difference here, because you could say the same thing about the law of gravity. The law of gravity is
Right.
general, and yet it works in the context that we're in. It works almost there is no, it doesn't apply in this case. It just works, right? And yet when we speak of moral principles and their application, it seems like there's a need to make this distinction. Okay, so you're right in principle, but you could be wrong on this particular
I
concrete.
think this is actually the same as context of knowledge. That context of knowledge, like when you discover the RH fact, you still applied the correct principles of epistemology, but concretely you were wrong. It was still the wrong answer. So it's not that you, the person ended up, well, maybe the person ended up dying in this case because of the being wrong concretely, even if the principle was correct. I think it's the same process going on of what makes knowledge still valid, despite getting it wrong sometimes, even getting it wrong with the right one, principles of epistemology. Like you said, it's not like you used the method wrong. It's just there's something else in reality that was unaccounted for, concretely speaking.
Okay.
And I think it's the same answer.
Okay. Right. Hmm. Although, I'm not sure. I need to think that one over more, because
Sure.
so they're saying, I remember the wording for this when I listened to The Art of Thinking on Certainty, is that if you let's say get on a plane and you're like, this plane, I'm certain that this
Right.
plane will not crash, and you crash and you're dead. We're just saying in retrospect, then apparently you still don't say you were wrong. It's just that reality, well, this is weird to speak about this in retrospect, but there was some factor that you did not account for. So let's say the Chinese Air Force shot you down.
Yeah.
She who shall not be named sent a missile into your plane, and so you didn't account for Xi Jing missile to arrive, and so you were shot down. And then if you were still alive somehow, then you just go, oh, there was another factor. There was the PLA. I didn't account for the PLA. And so it didn't contradict. You were still certain and you're still right. But right in your, because you had that qualification of within my context of knowledge. You know what I'm saying? Because you said within my context of knowledge, you were still right. But there was
Yeah.
more context to account for. But what I don't get is that, well,
To me, it seemed like Peacock was giving a pithy answer, not that. I mean, to me, it doesn't make sense to say you were not even wrong. Like, well, you were wrong concretely. That seems a better way to put it than just saying you weren't wrong.
It's
I mean, the principle
confusing.
was right.
Yeah, it's confusing when you just think about it in simple terms and like you were wrong or right. But if you consider that he says you have to say implicitly in every inductive generalization or complex item of knowledge, you're implicitly saying, barring unforeseeable accidents and within my current context of knowledge, then you have to be right. You're still right, even if you get shot down. But obviously you need to account for everything, that all your knowledge. And so if it happens that you survive that crash, you're like, oh, okay, I need to account for the PLA next time and their missiles.
True.
And so that's what he meant. But then when it applies to moral principles, what I'm confused by is they're trying to capture everything that's relevant, like the most essential causal factors or variables, our nature, the nature of reality, in order to guide you to effective action. So they're supposed to take into account everything that you need. And yet, when something goes wrong, it must be either because you've made a mistake in applying it, which we can put that one aside now. But
Yes.
then what would it mean for reality to introduce a factor you didn't account for in terms of a principle? Because principles are supposed to be context, in a sense, contextless. They're not contextless, but in a sense, contextless, like the law of gravity, because human nature always applies, right? And so what is that new factor that's being introduced is what I'm a little bit confused by.
I'm not sure I could answer better than saying they won't capture every concrete instance, nor could they ever. They just capture as many wide instances as possible and integrate every instance, but they might fail to integrate a particular concrete thing that occurs. It can be right in principle, not to leave the concrete right. And every particular choice. Well, for one, also, even that maybe not every choice you make, you could use a principle, because remember, it's not just saying about using principles and those principles being right. It's talking about method of choosing. I'm trying to break this down more to make sure you're right in principle. You could say you're right in theory. In a way, you could say you're right about the way reality functions, but you might not be concretely right in this instance, because in any instance there might be some, well, in this instance there might be some factor that changed things.
Actually, maybe a way to think about it is, I was just thinking of this now. So principles capture some broad fundamental things which are always true, like let's say the nature of your consciousness, the fact that you think in concepts, and that always applies no matter if you fly from Sydney to New York, or you fly from Sydney to Belarus and the PLA shoots you down. Like those principles, those are always true, right? So you're not wrong. But what I'm thinking is that philosophical principles don't account for every single factor of reality, every aspect of reality. For that, you need science, right? Like radar detection systems, you need, and there are more principles that you might need to handle more things. But the philosophical principles just set some very basic thing which lets you account for certain factors in reality. Like,
I think there's a better way to look at it. Yes,
something like that. I think I'm in a closer direction there, but
yes, that's a better direction.
Yeah,
like you might not be like, what about this concrete instance? Like, what about this bird outside at this time and this geographic location at this time of day, and it's at that age, at that distance from its house? And every concrete thing you can think of, is a principle going to tell you everything about that concrete bird? That's
not a philosophical principle, but maybe science, maybe
a
principles from biology, and then you need scientific principles to set up some kind of, electronic observation system, and it's all layered in a sense, but the philosophical ones capture certain fundamentals. And I don't know.
The philosophical ones are the most broad and fundamental, but obviously they won't, or even within smaller ones, like say biology is not going to tell you about how the birds fly, like not the physics of flying. For instance, it won't tell you any principles about that. It won't tell you concretely why this bird is flying, but it will tell you why it lays eggs.
So basically, the more control we want over reality, the more principles we need, but they're not philosophical. Like philosophical are the base, but then we've got to layer on way more principles on top of that, right?
Yes, principles upon principles. There's no end to them.
From scientific.
From scientific angles.
Okay, cool. I don't know.